אוקיי, שלום לכולם, ברוכות הבאות לעיניים על עזה, ההתכנסות היומית שלנו שהיא חיבור של מחאה ולמידה. המפגש היום יארך בשפה האנגלית, עליה אני עוברת מיד. Hello all and welcome to Eyes on Gaza, our daily meeting, which is a combination of a teach-in and a protest. Our speaker today is Peter Bieinart, professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, and widely regarded as one of the central liberal voices in today's Jewish American society. He has published several books, and most recently, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. He will speak us today on, quote, why American opinion on Israel-Palestine is changing. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us at such an early hour for you. I will remind everyone that Peter will talk for about 8 minutes, after which we will leave some time for brief discussions. You're welcome to write your question in the chat or your questions in the chat, and I will read them out to him. Thank you. The floor is yours, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be with all of you. I mean, I can't express how much admiration I have for Israelis who are fighting to end the horror in Gaza. I don't really understand how difficult it is to do that in Israel today, and it's really very important to those of us here in the United States to see Jewish Israelis doing that. Since there's nothing I could say about Israel and Palestine that you don't know better than me, I'll talk about something I do know perhaps a little more about, which is the U.S. I think that for reasons that I'm still trying to understand, I think there has been a kind of a tipping point in American public discourse about Israel and Palestine. It really that has been there was such an avalanche of outrage against him for not saying plainly that he would stop arms sales to Israel, that the next day he basically clarified and said he would stop arms sales, which I think is just a sign of where public discourse is in the Democratic Party. Another remarkable example just a couple of days ago was there's a member of Congress from North Carolina, a Black Congresswoman named Valerie Foushee. She was one of the Democrats over the last few years who has gotten the most money from AIPAC. In fact, she won her race against a more progressive Black candidate, in part because AIPAC invested very, very heavily in her race. AIPAC has particularly invested very heavily in races of Black members of Congress because in the Black districts, you tend to have some more progressive pro-Palestinian members of Congress. This woman who's gotten millions of dollars from AIPAC, despite that, became a co-sponsor of the House version of Bernie Sanders' bill to cut off military aid, even despite having such a close relationship to AIPAC. The third example is something that's happening on the Republican side, because we've become accustomed to a shift in public opinion among Democrats on Israel, but now we're starting to see it among Republicans. The difference is that in the Democratic Party, it used to be that only younger Democrats were polling as being very, very unfavorable to Israel. In the Democratic Party, that generation gap has now basically disappeared, and older Democrats have essentially caught up. So there's not really much of a generation gap among Democrats. Basically, older and younger Democrats are both overwhelmingly likely to say they feel unfavorable towards Israel and much more favorable towards the Palestinians, which is a complete reverse from 10 years ago. 10 years ago, in the Democratic Party, people favored Israel over the Palestinians by about 35 percentage points. Now it's exactly the opposite. Democrats favor Palestinians over Israel by about 35 percentage points, and there's not a huge gap anymore between younger and older Democrats. The really remarkable thing that's happened in public opinion in the last very relatively recently is the shift among young Republicans. A majority of young Republicans now have negative perceptions of Israel. And so the huge generation gap now exists in the Republican Party. The one cohort of Americans who remain very staunchly pro-Israel are older Republicans, but among young Republicans, many of whom are very, very kind of MAGA and pro-Trump, there's been this really dramatic shift. There was a very, I'm not sure if I could recommend that you watch it because it's so bizarre, but if you want to get a sense of kind of discourse on this issue on the American right, there was a debate recently, really a debate between three lunatics. One of them was, but different kinds of lunatics. One of them is Dinesh D'Souza, who's a long kind of standing anti-Muslim bigot who's very, very pro-Trump. And he was debating Nick Fuentes, who's basically a self-declared neo-Nazi, who's very, very pro-Trump. And they was moderated by Alex Jones, who's just a certifiable lunatic, who goes the guy who became famous for saying that the Sandy Hook shooting was made up. All three of these people are crazy, but all three of these people actually have significant following on the right, and Nick Fuentes particularly on the youthful right. And they're debating Israel. They're debating about whether MAGA Republicans should support Israel or not. Fuentes is saying no, because he hates Muslims. And D'Souza is arguing yes. At one point in this several-hour-long debate, Alex Jones is looking at all of the messages they're getting in from all of the people who are watching, thousands and thousands of messages, and Alex Jones repeatedly exclaims, I can't find a single pro-Israel message of the hundreds or thousands that we are getting in this conversation, right? You see this among you see this among Tucker Carlson, you see this among Candace Owens. Now, this right-wing anti-Israel kind of explosion of right-wing anti-Israel sentiment is in a lot of ways quite problematic. There's a lot of conspiracy theorizing involved in it. It can bleed into anti-Semitism, certainly with Nick Fuentes, someone like him, in a very, very naked way. You're seeing it now in the Republican Party with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, very, very Trumpy Republican. Interestingly, she only refers to Israel as nuclear-armed Israel. She's just started to describe Israel. She started to talk about a genocide. It's hard to know exactly how this shift in public opinion is going to translate into political action. But you now have about half of the Democrats in the Senate supporting a cutoff of arms sales. And I would think that over time, that with every passing, month or 6 months, that number will grow. I guess I'll just stop by trying to offer a couple of thoughts about why this has happened. I think it's partly because in some ways, one of the features of the Trump administration in both parties is that some of the traditional gatekeepers on what was acceptable to think in American politics have been kind of shattered, right? I mean, this is an environment in the Republican Party, for instance, in which the entire Republican Party, which was 10 years ago quite pro-free trade, has basically, the gatekeepers who made the party pro-free trade have completely collapsed, right? And the party has completely shifted. So in an environment in which there's a very anti-establishment mood, in which Trump has a kind of cult of personality, it's hard to enforce some of these traditional norms that existed in the Republican Party. There's also the Republican Party is extremely nationalistic and extremely conspiratorial, and I think those two impulses and quite anti-war. And I think that combination it can be kind of used to lead to people to be very, very suspicious of Israel on the basis that Israel is leading America into wars, and that Israel is part of a kind of, and pro-Israel groups are part of a kind of political conspiracy in Washington, led by elites. And in the Democratic Party, I think that the question of in the Democratic Party, Israel has, in the Netanyahu era for quite a few years now, become seen as a kind of embodiment of the kind of America that progressives don't want America to become. A country in which there are very, very clear legal hierarchies between members of different ethnic or religious groups, a country with an immigration policy that only lets in people of one dominant ethnic group, a country that very, very aggressively flouts international law, a country with a lot of people who in its leadership who are kind of religious fanatics. And I think over time, the association of Netanyahu with that vision of America, partly because Netanyahu was such an American figure, has had an impact on Democrats. And then Israel's policy, and this is where I'll stop, Israel's policy on food aid, I think, was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, it is, to me, kind of a remarkable act, just even putting aside the horror, the kind of the profound immorality of the hubris of a government in which the prime minister, after being indicted for the war crime of starvation in November of last year, responds after that, right, by cutting off all food for 2.5 months or so. And then, even when they allow the trickle of food, basically shuts down the entire food distribution system and replaces 400 food distribution centers with 4 run by people who don't know what the heck they're doing, right? I think that has kind of escalated this shift among mainstream progressives and even some Republicans. So I'll stop, and I'm happy to chat about it.
Thank you, Peter. There's already a couple questions that you kind of did the cleavage between, you talked about Republicans and Democrats, and I want to talk about, or I would like you to maybe say a few words about some other important constituencies. One is Jewish Americans, right? What is happening with Jewish Americans? And I know you've written about that, and I think we would like to know that, but also about, we've heard here about Christian Zionists, right? And their power. And how does that figure in with these changes that you're talking about?
That's great questions. I mean, American Jews are, you probably won't be surprised to you, American Jews are very, very profoundly divided. And the gap between the kind of organized American Jewish leadership and American Jews as a whole just widens and widens, right? And you can see it in New York City, right? So the American Jewish political establishment, basically in New York City, the view about Zohar Mamdani is that he's a threat to Jews, right? And that his potential election as mayor is a crisis, right? But there was a poll that came out last week that showed among Jewish New Yorkers under the age of 40, Mamdani has 67% of support, right? I mean, so it was a poll that came out I think it was May, which showed that among American Jews under the age of 44, 38% said that Israel was committing genocide. That was more than a year ago now. Before the Amnesty report, so I'm sure it's significantly higher now. So basically, young American Jews who are not Orthodox, a very large percentage of them, it's hard to know exactly how, because mostly because the polling questions are not usually very good, a very substantial percentage of them, maybe not a majority, but if not a majority, a large minority, have views on Israel that would actually be considered anti-Semitic by major American Jewish organizations. I mean, that's the irony, right? Is that when people talk about the anti-Semitism crisis in America today, there are real problems with anti-Semitism. But by the definitions of the Anti-Defamation League, we have a very serious anti-Semitism problem among young American Jews, because a very large minority of young American Jews, potentially even a majority of American Jews, hold anti-Zionist views that would be considered anti-Semitic by Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League. On the question of Christian Zionists, which is not one that I know as well, my sense is that, that there's still a very strong Christian Zionist support for Israel, but that America has become more secular. American conservatism has become more secular. Not that people don't say they believe in God, but church participation is down. And church participation is particularly down among working class white conservatives. That basically a class divide has opened up, where middle and upper middle class conservatives still go to church, but working class conservatives are less likely to go to church. If you read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, you kind of get a sense of this. It's kind of like part of the whole kind of bowling alone, kind of deinstitutionalization that you're seeing. And Trump has always done very, very well among right-wing people who don't go to church. If you go back to 2016, Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee basically won the people who were going to church. Trump won people who weren't going to church. And if you look at people like Tucker Carlson, for instance, some of those people, it is a more secular discourse. And I think it's just a theory. I do think part of the growing secularization and the kind of extreme nationalism on the right is part of the turn against Israel. Whereas people who are still in church every week, I imagine, are probably still more pro-Israel, but a lot of those young MAGA Republicans aren't in church every week.
It's very interesting. There's a couple questions here about the leverages that liberal American Jews can use in order to put pressure on Netanyahu and his government, either in Congress. There's mention here of Alyssa Slotkin as a relatively sane Democrat that has been disappointing so far.
Yes.
So it seems that even, right, what is the political leverage that liberal, either Jews or not Jews, have in Congress?
Yeah, I mean, Alyssa Slotkin, again, if you want to waste some time trying to get a sense of the flavor of the discourse, I would recommend watching the interview that she did on this website called Breaking Points. The first of all, the fact that she went on it itself was kind of interesting because it's a kind of an alternative, quite left-wing talk show, basically, in which the woman who basically one of the hosts has become increasingly uninhibited and increasingly passionate on the question of Gaza, and she was extremely tough on Alyssa Slotkin, and Alyssa Slotkin was extremely, extremely uncomfortable in the conversation, and it just showed how difficult it is to take a position that continues in which you don't explicitly support don't support calling for an end to arms sales in any kind of progressive space. I think that the point of leverage is really, this is going to play out in the Democratic presidential primary. That's where these things generally get hashed out in American politics. And the question will be, I think that the Democrats who try to stick to a more kind of pro-Israel politics, like Josh Shapiro, for instance, or Wes Moore or Cory Booker, I think they're going to have a lot of difficulty. I think it's going to be a source of real trouble for them politically, and I think that and I think we're going to see how difficult a stance that is to take when people start to campaign in Iowa. Iowa and New Hampshire in actually are particularly kind of peace-nicky states, especially Iowa. It's hard to know what the Democratic primary calendar will be because it got shifted under Biden. But I think actually that it'll be in the presidential primaries that we'll get a sense of this.
There's another interesting question here from Kobe who asks, it says that looking from afar, it seems that much of the debate on the Jewish left, sort of within the Jewish left, is on Zionism versus anti-Zionism, even maybe more than on the war in Gaza?
Well, that may be because there's a consensus when it comes to the war in Gaza, right? I mean, maybe there wasn't originally, but I think, if you look at a group like J Street, right, which is a kind of liberal Zionist, but, two states, opposes the occupation and settlements. J Street was initially unwilling to call for a ceasefire. I think it took them until January 2024. So that was very different than Jewish Voice for Peace, which is, was basically protesting for a ceasefire within almost immediately. But now that divide has closed. J Street is not only calling for a ceasefire, but even basically saying it accepts the word genocide. So I think that's part of the reason probably you see this debate, is the sense that the debate about the validity of the continued assault on Gaza, there's really nobody on the Jewish left who anymore would argue that point.
So maybe just one last question. We have time, just under a minute. Would you say that the U.S. stopping selling weapons to Israel is a real possibility at this point? And if so, what in your view still needs to happen? What pressure still needs to be put on for that to happen?
I mean, the Democrats have no influence over Trump, and so I don't think it's likely to happen over Trump. I mean, Trump is somewhat unpredictable, but generally, I would say the pattern on Trump on Israel is that Trump says all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, we saw this in his first term too. At the end of the day, his policies tend to be relatively supportive of Israel, especially when it comes to Palestinians. Perhaps less so when the Saudis and the Emiratis, really, really push him. But I think that, so I don't think, unfortunately, from my point of view, this is likely to happen under Trump. But I do think if we have a Democratic president, I mean, the future of American politics and American democracy, as you know, is very, very much up in the air. But if the Democrats return to power, I think that the next Democratic president will have a policy which is probably more like the policies that we're seeing to emerge in Europe, which are also kind of moving, I think, fairly significantly, more like the policy direction we're seeing in Europe than the Biden administration.
Peter, there are more questions here, but we do not have more time. Thank you very, very much for raising all of these very important points. Those who want to read more of your writing, we will post links to your Substack and other forums. I thank you very, very, very much for joining us today. This has been insightful and informative. I thank you, everyone, for coming. We will see you tomorrow, as usual, same link, same place, 2 p.m. Eyes on Gaza. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.